And the day that I wrote this, I came home that evening and I was telling my family about it. I was just jazzed about it because it was just so new and so interesting to me. I thought it was cool because I had never seen this before in the scriptures. And as I shared with another pastor, I thought, well, gosh, how did I miss this? I've been in ministry for 20 years and I have degrees in Bible and all that kind of stuff. And I shared with another pastor the story and they said, well, I don't remember that one either. So this morning, if this is a familiar story to you, you can consider yourself a Bible scholar, okay? We're going to be moving through a fairly large portion of text as we've been doing the last several weeks together. And again, it's going to be the case this week, so we're not going to read every word of the text. In some parts, I'm just going to tell you the story. Other parts, we'll read it. But let me invite you to open your Bibles with me to 1 Samuel chapter 26 this morning. And just hold your place there as we get ready to go through this story. David's life has been a roller coaster so far, hasn't it? I mean, it is hills and valleys. And let me warn you, we're getting ready to hit another hill this morning, okay? So we're going to be moving through this text together. And I would encourage you, because we are moving so quickly through it, to take time to read it throughout the week on your own. Go back maybe and read this story. See if you see some things that maybe we weren't able to cover this morning. Now, we're not going to read all of chapter 26 this morning because of time limitations. But chapter 26 is very similar to chapter 24. And you might remember the story. We spent a whole week on chapter 24. That was the story where David was hiding out in the cave and Saul goes in to use the bathroom. Do you remember that story? And David and his men tell him, now's your chance. Take him out. And David says, no, he's the Lord's anointed. And I'm not going to touch him. That'll have to be for God to take care of. And in chapter 26, we have a very similar story, except this time it's not in a cave. It's in a campsite. And David and his men sneak up on Saul. And Saul is laying there sleeping. And David's men say, now's your time. Take the sword and plunge it through him. Pin him to the ground, they say. And David says, no, I'm not going to do it. And the same sorts of dynamics happen in chapter 26. The very end of chapter 26, we read in verse 25, then Saul said to David, may you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph. So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. When we open up chapter 27, and let me invite you to flip over to chapter 27 here, we open up a new chapter in David's life. And this is the chapter that I'd like to concentrate in, or at least this season of life is the one I'd like to concentrate on today. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 1, but David thought to himself, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Now, I don't know if you write in your Bibles, but if you do write in your Bibles, I would encourage you to underline that phrase. David thought to himself. I think that's the key phrase here. Because as we move forward, we're going to see David not necessarily walking with God. He's thinking for himself here. He's acting on his own here. And where does he go? But he goes to the land of the Philistines. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, isn't this the pagan country? Isn't this Goliath's home? Exactly, right? And that's where David's going. Not only does he go to the Philistines, but he becomes friends with the Philistine king. I mean, they're buddies here. So David at this point, he has 2 wives. He has children. He has 600 men, and they have wives and children, and they're all going together to the land of the Philistines. And we're told here that the Philistine king, Achish, he likes David, and he likes him so much that he gives him some land to live on. Look at verse 6. So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag. It has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. We read of David attacking neighboring areas and wiping them out. Look at verse 9. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive. But he took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. See, David wipes them out completely. He doesn't want anybody alive who's going to go back to Saul and say, we know where David is, right? He's still hiding out from Saul. Saul is still after him. And David is wiping out these neighboring areas. He's going back to Achish. He's reporting to him. And the more he does it, the more Achish is thinking, this guy is really cool, right? I mean, he's taking out all these people for me. He's protecting the land. And I will mention to you, and I think this is an important detail, that from this point all the way until we get to chapter 30, we don't see the word God or Lord coming out of David's mouth. Not one time. Now, the Lord is mentioned in another story, and the Philistine king mentions Lord in one place, but David does not mention God for all of these chapters. David is living life as he wants to live life, as he thinks best. And he's living life in this pagan country among a pagan people. We read in verse 12 here. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he's become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever. Achish likes David. Achish is happy about what David is doing for him. He's protecting his land. And Achish is thinking, this guy's going to be here forever. This whole deal is going to work out just fine. We move to chapter 28, and this is where it gets interesting. The Philistines are getting ready to fight Israel, David's people. Look what happens in verse 1 of chapter 28. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. Now, I can imagine the conversation here, right? David, you've been helping me out. I really like the way you're taking out all these neighboring countries, kind of securing our borders. And now we're getting ready to fight against Israel. And you're in, right, David? I mean, these are your people, but you're on my team now, right, David? You going to go with me? You going to fight? And David says, yeah, I'm in. I'll take them out. I'll do whatever I need to do here. Think about this for a minute. David is ready to turn on his own people. David is ready to go into battle against the people of God. That is striking, isn't it? To imagine David suited up in Philistine armor. I mean, think about this. These are Goliath's people, right? And if we think of the teenager back in chapter 17, 1 Samuel 17, we read David saying this, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? You see, David as a teenager was totally offended by the message of the Philistines, right? David was walking with God, and when someone blasphemed God, he was ready to fight against them, right? But now David is in Philistine armor, Goliath's people. He's suited up, and he's getting ready to fight battle against Israel. It's astonishing here. It's stunning. David, as a teenager, could not take God's name being defied, but now David seems to be okay with it, doesn't he? David has switched teams. And it seems like David will stay this way forever. Look at verse 2 here. David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. And Achish replied, very well. I will make you my bodyguard for life. He's so happy with David. He's so glad David is now on his team. I mean, it's like the football team getting the number one recruit from the other team, right? He's got him on his team now. And they're happy. He's happy that he's on his team. And they're getting ready to fight against the people of God. Now, as is the case with many times you're watching a movie, you kind of get to this climax of the movie. Here's David suited up in Philistine armor. He's getting ready to go into battle, and the scene fades out, and the scene opens up with Saul. Now, chapter 28, some scholars will tell us that this is chronologically out of order here, okay? And it is, because what happens in chapter 28, the story with Saul, really belongs over before chapter 30, okay? But when you're telling a story, you're not always going to just tell it, this happened and this happened and this happened. Sometimes it fades out and we open up with another scene. And that's what we're getting here in chapter 28. And do you remember me telling you back in the first part of this series that the story of David would never be boring, right? This is another one of those cases. I mean, this scene here in chapter 28, it could be in the movie The Lord of the Rings or something like that. I mean, it is very interesting here. So David is suited up with the Philistines, and the story turns to Saul. Now, again, I won't spend much time here, but I don't want to skip over this because the story is just so very interesting here. It's worth... So as we open up here with Saul in chapter 28, we see David suited up with the Philistines, and we have Saul here, and we read in verse 3 that Samuel is now dead. Look at verse 3. Now Samuel was dead. He's the prophet. Remember, he's the one who anointed David. He's now dead, and all of Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. So in other words, the prophet is dead, and all of the witches and mediums and spiritists are also dead. So Saul has no way to consult God here, okay? And Saul is getting ready to fight the Philistines, and he's terrified. He doesn't know what's going to happen. Look at verse 5. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or by Urim or prophets. So Saul is about to fight. He doesn't know what's going to happen here. He's afraid. He's desperate. He needs direction. And so what does he do? Look at verse 7. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium," another translation says witch there, "so that I may go and inquire of her. There is one in Endor," they said. So he finds this medium. He finds this witch. And again, I told you this wouldn't be boring, right? So he travels to her dressed in normal clothes. Verse 8. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and I'll bring up for me the one I name." Now she says, "Wait a minute, this work is illegal around here. We can't do this kind of work anymore." Saul says, "No, you'll be okay. Go ahead and do it." Who does Saul want to consult? Look at verse 11. Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. She does her work. She somehow gets in touch with Samuel. Now remember, Samuel is dead, okay? So this is what makes this pretty interesting here. Verse 12. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." So she gets insight into who this guy dressed in normal clothes is. Saul assures her that she will not be punished for doing what she's doing. You're okay to do this. They continue to communicate with Samuel, and Samuel says the same thing to Saul that he said when he was alive. Samuel reminds Saul that God has rejected him as king and that will one day give the kingdom to David. But he adds to it in verse 19. He says, "The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." Terrifying news for Saul, right? Because Samuel's dead. You don't want to be where he is, right? You know what's going on here. Saul is so distraught by this news that he refuses to eat. The rest of the chapter, his men are trying to get him to eat. The witch goes and butchers a calf, cooks a steak dinner, and they all eat and leave. That's the story in a nutshell there. Moving pretty quick here. Going to chapter 9 here. The scene shifts back to David. Again, he's suited up with the Philistines. He's ready to fight. But God has another plan. You see, the commanders, now the king Achish, he's happy with David. He trusts David. He's happy that David's now on his team. But the commanders aren't so sure about David. In fact, they say, "Isn't he the one that killed Goliath, right?" "Yeah, he's the one." "Isn't he the one that's taken us out over and over again?" "Yeah, he's the one." "Well, I don't think I want him fighting with us. Maybe he's going to trick us. Maybe in the middle of the battle he'll switch teams and then take us out. I don't think I want him fighting with us." So the commanders and the king are having an argument about David, and finally the commanders win. And they tell Achish, "Go tell David that he can't fight with us." So Achish goes and tells David in verse 6. Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in my army." By the way, notice that Achish uses the name the Lord there. That's the only time it's used, and it's used not by David, but by the Philistine king here. He says, I found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. David wants to fight, but God doesn't want him to. And Achish comes to him and says, you're not going to be able to fight. Now, David, leave in peace. Don't get mad. Don't do something crazy. Just go back to the land that I gave you. And so, again, David's not happy, but David heads out with his men, and they go back to the land. As we flip over to chapter 30, we find David heading back to the land where his wives and children are. Again, God has stepped in here. He's kept David from fighting against his own people. But look what happens next in the story. David and his men, this is chapter 30, verse 1. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now, the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. You could imagine David and his men are crushed at the sight. Can you imagine them coming over the hill and seeing maybe the buildings with maybe smoke still coming out of it? They get there, their wives and children are nowhere to be found. It's clear they've been taken into slavery. There's loud weeping. There's distress. We read here in verse 3, when David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. Loud weeping here, distress. And then look closely at me with me at the next verse, verse 6. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. I mean, it's not been going well for David, has it? I mean, he was getting ready to fight with the Philistines. They said, you can't do it. He's probably mad about that. He's heading back. He gets there. His village has been ransacked. His wife and kids taken into slavery. And now his men are upset at him, right? Nobody's happy with David. They're ready to stone him. He's lost everything. And we come to verse 6, and this is a key verse here in the text. Look what it says. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Powerful verse there. Why is it powerful? It's powerful because David has been doing things on his own. But now crisis hits. Now his world falls apart. Now everything that he values is gone. And where does David turn? He turns to God. And he finds strength in God. I think these are two bookends here. We see these two verses together. 1 Samuel chapter 27:1. But David thought to himself. That's where we were. And now it says, but David found strength in the Lord his God. You see, the story's bookended by those two verses. This is a story of David going on his own. And now, when crisis hits, he turns back to God. You see, we think about this for a minute. This is often what we do, isn't it? We often kind of live life however we want to live life, but when crisis hits, we turn back to God. You see, I don't think David became an atheist. I don't think David stopped believing in God. I don't think that David started taking up Philistine worship. I don't think all that happened. Yeah, I think he would have said that if it happened. But I think David wandered away from the God that he loved so much. His heart was not in an intimate relationship as it was before, you see. David was kind of doing things on his own. And maybe you've had that experience. Maybe you just wake up one day and you think, it's not the same as it used to be. I don't spend time with God like I used to. I don't find myself reading the Bible and praying. And slowly and surely, that intimate relationship with God has faded away. Maybe that's where you are today. But as is often the case with many of us, God tends to get our attention, doesn't he? Something happens. Our world falls apart. Our dreams are shattered. And all of a sudden we look and there is God standing there. He'd been standing there the whole time, right? God never left David. God never abandoned David. David's the one who walked away. And when David turns back around, there's God standing there with arms open wide. And God saying, find strength in me. I've been here the whole time. David turns to God and he finds strength in God. Look what he says in verse 7. Bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought to him, and David inquired of the Lord. The priest has probably been pretty bored the last few years, right? Or the last year. He had a lot to do because David's kind of been ignoring God, but all of a sudden, and this is the thing too that strikes me. He gets back, the town is ransacked, and the women and children have been carried away into slavery. Now, I don't know about you, but it's a no-brainer, isn't it, that you go find the women and children, right? Let's go. And the men are like, let's get our stuff, let's go. And David's go, well, wait a minute. We're not going anywhere unless God wants us to go. I mean, a no-brainer decision. David takes the time to bring out the ephod and to worship and to pray and to ask God, should we go? Because we're not going if God doesn't want us to go. And David asks for the ephod, and God tells him, yes, you can pursue them. And so they do go. Now, along the way, they lose 200 of their 600 men. So here they are, okay? David has sought strength in the Lord. They've worshiped. They've discerned whether or not they should go. And so they go. And along the way, 200 of the men are exhausted. Now, you have to wonder what happened. Did a virus hit them or something? And maybe they're just wiped out? We're not sure, but 200 of the men are unable to go. Look at verse 10 here in chapter 30. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. Along the way, they find this Egyptian sitting in a field. And when they come upon him, he's starving. So they give him food. And they're thinking, what's this dude sitting out here? Why are you out in the field by yourself? Look what he says in verse 13. He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. Now here's the kicker. We raided the Negev, verse 14, of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb. And we, what? Burned Ziklag. Oh, wow. This Egyptian sitting out in the middle of the field who's left there is a part of the group that burned David's land. No accident here, right? And David's like, oh, well, maybe you could help us out a little bit here. Maybe you could tell us where they are. Maybe you could show us where they are. And the Egyptian says, okay, if you promise not to kill me, I'm with you. David says, oh, we're not going to kill you. Go with us. And so they go. They find the Amalekites, the raiders. They fight them. And in the end, in verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. Isn't that astounding? Not one person was lost. Not one thing was lost. God had used this crisis in David's life, but God didn't take away anything at this point, did he? David turned back to God. They go, they find this Egyptian, they find the stuff, and they get it. Now, we're moving quick through this story, right? I hope you're awake this morning, right? So I'm going to give you a little test here, okay? How many men did David have at this point? 400, right? He had 600. And so 200 men are just kind of wandering out there, okay? And so hang on with me because we got more of the story here. It gets more interesting here. They're heading back and they bump into the 200 men along the way. Now, we're told again, David has recovered everything. He's got his wives, his stuff, and he's also got the 200 men's stuff and their wives and their children, right? And they bump into them. And look at verse 21 with me. As David and his men approached, he greeted them. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. I love how those men are described there, don't you? They're described as evil men and troublemakers. Sounds like a church business meeting, doesn't it? The men have their stuff, and they're greedy, right? We got our stuff. We went out there. We fought, and these guys, these 200, they didn't go with us. So we're not going to give them their stuff back, right? But David has a different response here. David doesn't feel entitled to this stuff. David has learned what it means to trust God. David has learned what it means to live in relationship with God. And entitlement and privilege are not part of the mix when you're following God. See, authentic followers of God understand that everything that we have is a gift from God. Everything that we have, it's not ours. It's only ours because God gave it to us. And look what David says in verse 23. David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and handed over to us the forces that came against us." It's all God's. You know, guys, when we're walking out there aimless and we bump into that Egyptian slave out in the middle of a field starving, he wasn't there by chance. He was there because God put him there, right? And when he showed us where the Amalekites were, and when we fought against them, and we beat them, we did that because God allowed us to do it. We didn't earn it. It's all God's. And everything that we have, it's God's. And he gave it to us. And we can't stand here and be greedy with it, he says. We've got to open our hands. And we got to share it with everybody. So he looks at the 200 there, and he says all will share alike in verse 24. We read in the final verses of the chapter here, not only does David share what he has with the 200 people, but when he gets back to Ziklag, he sends gifts to Judah, to the people of Israel. The people he was going to fight against, he's sending this plunder to them as gifts. See, David is in an entirely different place at the end of chapter 30 than he was at the beginning of chapter 27. Now, I don't know about you, but I read this story and I think, whoa. You know, remember it wasn't too long ago we were reading about the story of Nob, you know, and David learned his lesson there, right? He turned to God and he's seeking God, but very quickly, David's right back on the track of doing whatever he wants to do. And God gets his attention again, and now he pulls him back. But this time it's going to be different. This time, David is ready. He's ready to be king. God's been working in him all the way from the sheep field through this time where he's running from his life for Saul, now living in Philistine territory, turning away from God again. Now he's back again, and now he's ready to be king. And we're going to see that unfold next week. So we're going to stop the story there today. A lot of text, huh? A lot of story. I'd love to know from some of you. I mean, if you're like, man, I learned that story in Sunday school, you need to let me know after church, okay? Because for me, it was totally unfamiliar. But it has everything to do with us today, doesn't it? As we look at this, and again, as we've skimmed over this story, this long story in just a few minutes this morning, I still think there is one point to this story. And the point is that it's a lesson about what it means to walk with God. And for you and me, it helps us, doesn't it, as we learn to walk with God, because we're a lot like David. We wander from God sometimes, and we find ourselves back with him, and then we wander again, and then we find ourselves back with him. But here David goes out on his own for a season. Again, I don't think God ever abandoned David. I don't think David fully abandoned God, even though he was going on his own there. He seemed to veer from that dependent, intimate relationship that he once had with God. But he discovers through crisis that God is really his only source of strength. You know, as we read the Psalms, we read David's words, I can't help but think that sometimes when David's talking about God being a rock, God being a fortress, God being all that we can depend on, he must have learned that lesson, don't you think, in these days? Look at Psalm 18. David wrote this. David said, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge. He is my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." And then in verse 31, "For who is God besides the Lord? And who is the rock except our God?" You see, David knew that, didn't he? When everybody turned against him, when his wives and children were captured and in slavery, when his men said, "Let's stone him," David said, "Only God was there. Only God gave me strength." Psalm 62, "He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken." David understands God's the only one we can depend on. And David understands that life is truly all about God. David emerges again from this dark period of his life, ready to be king. This morning, maybe God is speaking to you. Maybe you're in a place where You've wandered away from God. You haven't stopped believing in Him. You just aren't in that place where you need to be with Him. Maybe this morning God would be calling you to come back. Maybe you would envision God with His arms open wide, ready for you to come, ready for you to turn, ready for you to understand what it means to live in an intimate relationship with Him, not taking one step without Him. Maybe this morning God would be speaking to you. And so as we stand and sing, as the band comes back this morning, let me invite you to stand and sing. If there's a decision you want to make, now would be the time that you would come down. If you want to come and pray at the altar, it's open. Let's all stand together.